So, welcome to the practical session of the general recipe for ML. So, these are the steps that we would want to take. We want to uh, prepare the first the data. So, basically, we want to determine the high level goals, find out the desired output, find out the relevant input, and collect data reasonably and ethically. We talked about this in the previous session. Uh, we want to do some exploratory data analysis. This is critical. So this exploratory data analysis basically uh, helps us figure out which variables are useful, how which variables are redundant, and whether we should add the variables or not. So a lot of visualization and manual data discovery happens during this process. Then we want to do the actual machine learning, which is shortlist the models, set up the training loops and validation that avoid overfitting and underfitting. And we want to try different data splits. Then we want to synthesize the results that we have, find out the models that work well for different splits and different initializations, and try not to get enamored by fluke models that work well, freakishly well, and in fact they work if they work freakishly well. Question the assumptions of your data collection, whether the data was that you collected was uh, indeed not didn't have the label leak into the data and so forth. Then you want to test, deploy, and monitor. Okay, so now let's go down. So here what I'm doing is, in this cell I am importing the libraries that I need. NumPy as NP, Pandas as PD. These are standard short forms, and Matplotlib for plotting as PLT. Seaborn is another plotting library. Import it as SNS usually. It has slightly better plotting quality aesthetics than Matplotlib alone, but it works with Matplotlib. Okay, and in this section we will import the data. This data is basically we are looking at two different kinds of heart monitoring patterns in fetuses, and it has been adapted from this repository. I have simplified it slightly for this example so that I can demonstrate certain concepts. So it's a binary classification problem in this case. There is one set of measurements and another set of measurements for the heartbeat of fetuses, and we want to be able to classify both. And so these lines of code basically help us import the data. There's a library called google.colab from which we can import the files, and basically it's as simple as upload is equal to files.upload. When I run this, I will get this cell which says choose files. I've already done that. You see the saved result. I will click on choose files. I will go to the place where I want to import the data, and that's it. And then basically it has imported this file, this CSV file, and it has, so this is for the training and the other is for testing. It has imported both files now. Okay, so once that is done, the first thing that we want to do is always we want to first look at the data through printing and visualization to figure out what is it that we are dealing with. Okay, so here I'm using a command called display train.df. So first of all, I will read the CSV files and convert them into data frames, panda data frames, pandas data frames. So this is PD pandas read CSV. So I'm reading those files. You will so if you are not using Google Colab, you will not need the previous step, which was uploading the files. You can directly uh, put the path in this particular row. Okay, so now the training data has been read into this data frame train underscore df, and testing has been read here. Now I want to display them. What I see is that I have 1497 rows and 26 columns, and the names of the columns are BE, LBE, LB, AC, etc. What are these? These are different measurements of the fetus heart waveform, cardio waveform. Okay, and similarly I have the same different uh, columns for the test data with a different number of rows. Okay, and the last column that you see, if I scroll to the right, is the class, and the class is binary, either 0 or 1. Okay. The other thing to note here is that different columns have different ranges. Some are high numbers, some are decimal numbers, and some of them, for example, we will find later dr, for example, doesn't vary at all, it is always 0. Okay, so after every code cell, usually I have a text cell where I note down my observations and what I need to do next. It's a form of documentation. So here my observation is that different columns are different scales, and also notice that one column is not present in the test data. So I think this was a mistake. This is not for this particular data set. This was for a different data set. So that particular column was not there. Next, we should check the data type of each column, and we should check for missing values, and we should look at the histogram to see if that variable is spread out. If the variance is too low, then it doesn't help us. Now, so I'm printing the data types. This is the training types and the testing types. They are going to be the same. So what we see is that some of them are integers, some of them are floating points, decimals. Okay, both of them we can treat as continuous. Integers means they are actually discrete, but if there are too many integer values, then it's actually most likely it is just a continuous value. Okay, just that it's quantized to an integer. Same with now for the test data. So observation, good, all data types are interfloat. That means they are numerical. They are not categorical. Had they been categorical, we would have converted them to dummy variables, dummy numbers, which is one hot bit encoding. Now let's see if we have diverse values. I have this particular piece of code which goes through all the columns. For all the columns, it finds all the unique values. Okay, and if the number of values, the number of unique values is less than 10, then it will even print them. Otherwise, it will just print how many values, unique values it has. So now look at this. B is integer, but it has 794 unique values, which means it's, for all practical purposes, it's a continuous variable, and 0 null entries. That means there are no null entries, no missing values, which is good. I don't need to drop any samples then. Otherwise, I would need to do data cleansing to drop those samples. Okay. Now notice this one. This one has only two unique values, which are 0 and 1. Okay, so this is a discrete variable and not a continuous variable. But for this purpose, for the purpose of this particular example, I will treat it as a continuous variable, although that may not be the right approach. Okay, so observations there, all columns, none of the columns have null entries. If they had null entries, if they had too many null entries, I can drop the column. If they have too few null entries, then I can drop the rows. Okay. There are only two classes, binary classes, 0 or 1. Okay, and some of the some of the predictor variables seem to have lot of unique values, so they are continuous. Variable dr has only one unique value. We will eliminate it later. Where is the variable dr? Look at this. Variable dr has only one unique value, which is 0, and it has no variance. We will drop them. Now next step is to visualize all of these to see whether they are spread out. So I will plot their histograms. So if first of all I will go through all the columns again, and I will plot their histogram. So if you look at these histograms, you can see that there are lots of different values for this variable called mean, and this variable called mode, and so forth. Some of them are highly skewed, they are towards 0. Sometimes that can create problems, and then we can drop those variables, but here I'm not going to. In tendency, there are only 3 unique values, so it's a discrete variable, and obviously class has only 2 unique values. I've skipped a lot of the histograms just to go through it quickly. This is another way of plotting the histograms, but here I am plotting only for the continuous variables that have lots of unique values. Not very many unique values. So all variables except dr seem to be spread well, and we want to drop this variable dr. Okay, and then we also want to see, now we want to see if two or more variables are um, correlated or not. Before that, let's first drop dr. So for that, I'm using this dot drop for a data frame. This is a pandas utility, pandas function, and we have to specify which axis we are dropping, and I'm automating it so that I can drop it from both training and test very easily. Okay, so now my data has one less column. Instead of 27, it has or yeah, 27. It has 25 variables. Now I want to see the correlation between pairs of variables, for which there is a function called scatter matrix, okay, where I can simply plot the scatter matrix of pairs of variables. And for when you are looking at a single variable, which is, let's say, variable I versus variable I, instead of the scatter, because scatter will be a straight line, we will plot its density, we will plot its histogram, but smoothened histogram, which we will for which we are using this kernel density estimation. Okay. Notice that we can only do this for, let's say, up to 20 or 30 variables. If you have 100 variables, the individual plots will become very small, and this is a lazy way of visualizing. But anyway, let's be lazy and let's visualize. So this is the all the diagonals that you see are single variables, okay, and the off diagonals that you see, these are scatter plots of pairs of variables. So you can see that this variable, the variable number 2, is highly correlated with variable number 1, and this will just be the reverse of that, mirror image of that. Variable number 4 is highly correlated with variable number 3. These two variables are not correlated. These are somewhat correlated, but like you'll see when the point cloud is spread out and it's not like a on a curve or on a line, then it is uncorrelated. If it is on a straight line, then it is linearly correlated. If it is on a very thin curve, then it is non-linearly correlated. So for one you will use Pearson correlation, for the other you will use Spearman correlation. The other thing to notice is that you have these vertical lines and you have these horizontal lines. That is because the variable is quantized. It has only a few integer values, either on the this particular variable you will see horizontal lines, and then if you look at the mirror image you will see vertical lines for the other variables. Nothing, just to keep in mind, there's nothing to do with it right now. Okay. All right, so now what we want to see is that we want to visualize this correlation in another way. So we will plot a correlation matrix. First we will compute a correlation matrix, okay, using this dot core, again a pandas, and here we are using Spearman because we are also interested in nonlinear correlations, and then we will plot it as a heat map. So this is Seaborn utility heat map, and you can specify the size of the plot also. Now here white is one correlation, but notice that I'm not just plotting correlation. Correlation can be perfectly negative also. Let me see if I have an example here. So this is a perfectly positive correlation. Negative correlation would have a slope like this. Let's see if you can spot one. Well, I don't see it in this data, so let's skip that. But I don't even perfect negative correlation is a strong correlation. That means there is data redundancy. You have some variable x and minus x of the same variable. So I'm interested in the absolute value of correlation. So I'm plotting the heat map of absolute values. So remember, where we had perfect straight lines, we will get these high white values for perfectly one correlation. Where there is no correlation, we will get these black in the heat map. So these white means that one of these two variables I can drop. Here two of the three variables I can drop in this block. Okay, sometimes the blocks appear off diagonal also. Okay, so we'll come to that in a bit, how to drop. But now let's look at side by side box plot. So basically for two classes, the class 0 and class 1, I want to see how each variable is spread, and if there is a difference in the spread, that means that variable is predictive of the class. If the spread of the variable is the same for class 0 and class 1, that means that variable is not predictive of the class. So to look at the spread of the variable, we use something called box plot, and this is the box plot. In the box plot, so this is the variable d for class 0 and class 1. So the distribution of the variable looks like so. Here this line is the mean, this is the upper quartile, this is the lower quartile, and this is the min and the max. And anything that is outside plus minus point, I think 2.5 of the interquartile range will be shown as an outlier with a dot. So you can see that this spread looks very similar to this spread. That means D is probably not going to be very informative of the class. On the other hand, let's look at some other variable which is informative. Here, if you look at this variable, which is AC, you can see that the mean of for class 0 is different from the mean of class 1, and that means that it is going to be indicative of the class. And you can see that these are the outliers, they are above uh, the interquartile range. Okay, so here look at this class versus class box plot. Obviously this will come out to be exactly 0 and exactly 1, so we don't want to get confused with that. It's a redundant variable, but looks like there are discriminative variables such as variance and AC that we looked at above. So now we want to do data preparation. We have already eliminated dr. We can also eliminate variables. So let's say you have 3 variables that are highly correlated. We can remove 2 of them and we can keep only one of them as a proxy for the other 2. So here what I'm doing is I'm preparing uh, a list of columns that I want to retain. So this excludes all the columns that I don't want. So for example, the ones that are correlated to any one of these are also removed. And then I will scale the data so that the mean of every column is 0 and the variance is 1. So this goes back to how not scaling the data can confuse some models which are dependent on the variance of the data. Random forest is not one of them, but support vector machine, um, neural networks, logistic regression, those are all sensitive to data scaling. So you want all columns to have the same scale. So for that, first I fit a scalar. Okay, what scalar I'm using? I'm using a standard scalar, which is the 0 mean and unit standard deviation for each column. Then I am forming this train X dataset where I'm fitting the scalar. Okay, I'm transforming the data, and I'm doing the same thing for the I will do the same thing for the test data. I will come to that in a bit. So what is the input for the training? That is this X, which is all the columns except for the class column. Okay, and that class column is not here in the columns to retain, and the class column is the Y. So that is what I want to predict. So now I want to show what is X. Now it is transformed. You can see all ranges are similar, and I will also print their mean. And then I will look at the correlation matrix again for the retained variables. So you can see all the means are 0, e to the minus 6, and you can look at the correlation matrix of the retained variables. Only the diagonals have high correlation, which means the variable is correlated with itself. Off diagonals are not close to 1. They have low correlation because I removed all the correlated variables. Now the standardization that I learned, basically the mean and the variance that I found for each column, I want to apply the exact same one for the test data. So I have test X, which has everything except the class, and test Y, which I will use for evaluation, which has everything, which only has the class variable. Here when I do the transformation, I'm using the same transformation that I use for the training data. I'm not relearning the transformation for the test data. So this is important. You cannot assume that you will be re-estimating mean and variance every time the test data comes. But in some cases, you actually might want to do that when, let's say, your data is being collected using a different equipment that has its own mean and variance. So you have to be careful in how which transformation you apply. Whether you use the same transformation as that what you same mean and variances that you computed for the training data, most likely that will be the case. Or you want the model to be robust to changes in the way the test data is collected, then you will re-estimate the means and the variances, or the min and the max if you're using min-max scalar. Okay, so again, now we see that the means are small, but they are not 0. Okay, for the test data. Okay. From here on, we will get into the ML part, which is the training and validation. So let's first try to find the good set of hyperparameters using grid search. That means we will do k-fold cross validation, and sorry, what is it that I'm doing here? We will do the k-fold cross validation. Yes, and we will try different hyperparameter values, and we will be looking at the F1 score. So if we are looking at binary classification, we can always look at accuracy, but accuracy may not always be a good measure. So let's say one class is very much prevalent than the other class. One class represents 90% of the data, the other class represents only 10% of the data. If you have a very dumb classifier that always says class 1, you already have 90% accuracy. So accuracy is not a good measure. You have to look at false positive rates as well as false negative rates. So a balance metric that looks at both of them, or the harmonic mean of both of them, is an F1 score. Another balance metric is ROC AUC. So this you will see here, ROC AUC. These are balance metrics. So for classification, look at these, but they only work for binary classification. Accuracy works for more than two classes also. But then you can look at pair-wise AUC, ROC, or something along those lines. Always try to account for the imbalance in classes. Don't get just enamored by accuracy without critically looking at whether the accuracy was for balanced classes or imbalanced classes. So now I will fit a support vector machine. It's a binary classifier, and I can have different types of kernels. I can have RBF kernel. These are different types of non-linearities. This is linear, and then polynomial kernel, and then I can have different regularization penalties. So more complex to less complex models. So this basically tightens whether it perfectly fits the data, or the training data, or it doesn't perfectly fit the training data, but then it will also probably not do bad on the validation data. So these are different hyperparameters. So every model that you use as a monkey, you should know what the hyperparameters are, and you should experiment with them. Okay, and these are different degrees of the polynomial for the polynomial kernel. Then I'm doing grid search. Okay, grid search cross validation for this classifier, and I will print the best parameters and the best score. Okay, and then I will use the same the learned model, the best model that I've learned. I will use that on the test data, okay, and print the entire report. So when I run this, what I get is that for RBF kernel with C is equal to 1 gives you the best fit, where your F1 score is 0.871. And when I fit it on the test data, I get pretty good F1 scores. I'm very happy with that, and I get a very good AUC, which is max can be 1. I get around 0.91, and same for F1 score, it ranges from 0 to 1. So this is really good result, and that's because the data was slightly easy. This 0.9 accuracy or F1 score and AUCs are like really good in many cases. But in mission critical problems, even 0.91 may not be very good. So for example, if you're driving a car and 0.91% of the times it doesn't get into an accident, that that is meaningless, right? You want 0.99999 AUCs and so forth, whatever is the metric for that particular scenario. Let's try another classifier. Now I'm using a random forest classifier where the hyperparameters are either max depth or n estimators. So I have entire range of things to test for max depth, entire range of things to test for n estimators, and I will put it in a grid search. So basically I'm forming a grid of max depth, n estimators, trying all these values, boom, 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 whichever one works the best for cross validation, that I will report, and I will use that on the test data. So I'm using it only once on the test data. Again, same set of things. I will predict I will show the best parameters, best score, and then I will use it on the test data. So here again, the best max depth is 20, and number of estimators is really high, 100. But F1 score I get is around 0.89, and look at the F1 score, it's really good, 0.95, 0.94, and the ROC score is 0.95. Now keep in mind here there is a little bit of non-monkeyness, little more smartness that you require about selecting the type of classifier. There are no good ways of determining that, but here what we saw in the data, if you remember, there were some variables that had very few distinct values. That means they were essentially discrete variables, not continuous variables. Don't go by the integer versus float. Integer can also be practically a continuous variable if it has too many unique values. But we had some integers that have very few unique values. Whenever you have very few unique values, a tree type model or a random forest that is a collection of trees will likely work better because it does discrete decisions, whereas SVM does continuous decisions. Is probably going to not be able to utilize that data very well. So whenever you have discrete categories, try a tree or a forest. Whenever you have mostly continuous values, you can try an SVM, support vector machine, with different types of kernels: polynomial kernel, RBF kernel, which is the Gaussian kernel or the radial basis function kernel. All right, now let's do the same thing, but let's do it in a more artistic way. Let's plot some things and see that, that overfitting, good region, underfitting, that let's visualize that a little better. So what I'll do is I will train a support vector machine again, but I will do it for different values of C, which is the regularization penalty, and I will range it from e to the power -3 to e to the power 9. Okay, and for each of these values, I will try to fit it 25 times so that I don't get a fluke model. I average all of them. So now I have parameters in this entire range from -3 to 9, and I'm trying different log C's. And what I will do is I will get, for each of value of C, I will get into a trial, and in that trial I will split the data in the ratio of 80-20. 80% will go to training and 20% will go to testing. Actually it's validation, it's not testing, it's validation, but I'm just calling it testing here. And first I fit the model. This is the fitting of the model, where I have already specified what C value I want to give, the hyperparameter, and I want probability true because I want to compute AUC, and then I will predict it on the validation dataset, and then I will compute the AUC, and ultimately I will take the mean AUC of the 25 trials. Okay. So now when I run this, it's trying different C values, log C values, and then I plot the AUC. You can see that the AUC is small for small C values. The AUC is again small for large C values. Somewhere in the middle, you get a sweet spot. Okay, so this is the correct fit. This is underfitting, and this C. So C is regularization. Sorry, this is underfitting. This is overfitting. Log C, yeah. But you can see that this is not very smooth, and that is the reality. The reality is that you will not get a very smooth curve. You can see this jaggedness here. So if you had just tried this range, you wouldn't know that whether this is the optimal or this is the optimal. So you have to try a wide range. That's just the nature of practical ML. So we have a sweet spot. Now let's try another hyperparameter. The other thing that I can change in RBF kernel SVM is something called the width of the RBF kernel, which is gamma. Okay, so I'm changing log of gamma from -5 to +2. So e to the power -5 to e to the power +2 is the gamma value. Again, I'm doing the same thing. I'm going through the entire loop and I'm doing 25 trials again, and I'm predicting and I'm fixing the C value now this time. Earlier I had fixed the gamma value. Now I'm using the fixed C values, which is, let's say, this e to the power 0. Where does it come from? This e to the power 0 gives me a good value, or e to the power 1, one of the two I can use. And now when I change the gamma value, I get a very smooth curve, and I see that the performance peaks for gamma e to the power -2. Okay, so these two I will plug in, gamma 1 and gamma e to the power -2 I will plug in, and I will train one final time and test now on that held out data, not the validation data but the held out data. So here I get F1 score of 0.92 and ROC of 0.92. Let's see what we had in cross validation CV. earlier with the complete automation. Yeah, I had 0.91 and now I get 0.92. I get slight improvement because I did a more rigorous way of finding the hyperparameters with the same model framework. Okay, so look at this. This is very beautiful. It gives you a single peak, but not you will not always get a single peak. Okay. Now let's say if your classification variable, the class variable was not given and you were doing clustering, right? So clustering, how can you even visualize 25 dimensions in clustering? You cannot. So there is a very handy tool called tsne. tsne uses a nonlinear transformation to bring the data to a lower dimension for visualization and for other analytical purposes. And something to change in this tsne is something called perplexity. You will see different graphs for that. So I'm using two components. That means I'll drop the dimension down from 25 to 2 and I will visualize it. So these are all the training data points visualized in 2 dimensions, although they're 25 dimensional. Okay. Now I want to do clustering. Now how many clusters do you see? Perhaps it doesn't seem like they are like, very distinctly spread clusters, but maybe this is one cluster, maybe this is another cluster, maybe this is another cluster, this is another cluster, and so forth. So like maybe 5 clusters. So I first use a fancy clustering technique called dbScan, where the hyperparameters are this epsilon and minimum samples. Once we get into the course, we will talk more about these. So we can use that and it will find the number of clusters. These don't look very pretty. Let's try k-means, which is more intuitive. Okay, so here I will try different number of clusters from 2 to 9, which is the hyperparameter of k-means clustering. So in dbScan you decide how close the point should be and it will find you the number of clusters. In k-means you define the number of clusters and it decides how close the point should be, the other way around in some way. That's broadly speaking. There are other differences as well. So I will try it for all these and I will plot the clustering result for cluster 2, cluster 3 clusters, 4 clusters and up to 9 clusters. The other thing that I will see is that how representative are these clusters of the entire data. That means if I find a cluster center, what is the average inter-cluster versus intra-cluster distance, and I want to optimize that and see if I get a curve, nice fitting curve with a nice peak for this metric using different values of k. Okay, so I'm going through this range of k's, and for this again I will do 25 trials or 5 trials, sorry, 5 trials for each k. Actually you don't need to do 5 trials, you will always get the same answer in k-means. We'll look at it in the course. Okay, and then for each trial I'll do fit and predict both on the training data. I'm not using the test data now, and I am computing a metric of clustering score which is called Davis-Bordin criteria. We will talk more about it in the course. As a smart monkey, you should find out what are good metrics for which particular type of problem. So for clustering, Davis-Bordin criteria or silhouette criteria are good metrics. So now I'm plotting these and you can see that this is how it divides 2 clusters. This is how it divides 3 clusters, 4, 5, etc. And then I will plot these metrics. This is the clustering score Davis-Bordin criteria for different number of clusters, and you can see it peaks around 5 clusters. And if you look at cluster average weighted purity of the cluster, which is basically how many different classes are there in a single cluster on an average, and I want I want it to be skewed towards only one class as opposed to a mix of classes. So 0 means 50-50 both classes and 1 means only one class. I can see that it also kind of saturates around 5. So it's intuitively satisfying that both of these metrics are kind of coinciding. Uh, Here I'm using class information. Actual clustering wouldn't use class information. Uh, that's it. So I hope you got a flavor of how to do some due diligence when you are going into machine learning problems without understanding the models themselves.